here because I really want people to stop and think for a bit about our garden cleanup habits. And so that's really the part that I want to talk about. Can we talk about our addiction to what I call the Better Homes and Gardens garden? This looks really nice on the cover of a magazine, but it is probably not something that we should be aspiring to in our gardens. As nice as it looks, I mean, you know, this is our current, you know, aesthetic on what we think is a pleasing garden. Oops, sorry. And this is in fact my front garden. Slightly different, and this is early spring. As you can see, I've got a lot of flowers, I've got flowering trees, I've got, you know, a whole hodgepodge of different kinds of plants, a lot of leaves that stay in my garden, and that's what my garden looks like once I've done what I consider enough garden cleanup. So, you know, it's not perfect, and my intention is not to have a perfect garden. What I want is a garden that will actually look attractive to me, provides me a lot of beauty because there's a lot of color in there, but it also provides a lot of habitat for insects, for wildlife, and especially a lot of birds, which is really important. Why do we want to change our thinking about what, you know, pleasing gardens should be? And I know this is quite a dramatic picture, and you know, these are not exactly insects that everyone gets really excited about because these happen to be wasps. But a couple of headlines in the last year indicate that we are in what is called an insect apocalypse. In studies done in Germany, flying insect populations have dropped as much as 75 to 82% in the last 27 years. And they now think that these drastic drops are occurring everywhere in the world. The problem is because we haven't actually been tracking insect populations in much of the world, we don't know if this is true, but we know that anecdotally that our insect populations are considerably less than they were. And so what I want to encourage you to think about is what I call an insect-friendly garden cleanup. So the first rule of insect-friendly garden cleanup, as much as we all want to get racing out into the garden and doing things, is to actually wait, to be patient. If you have, you know, flower stalks that you left in the fall, and hopefully you did, they can sometimes become habitat for what we call mason bees, or insects that actually use the hollow stems of plants to overwinter. Clumps of coneflowers, for instance, will provide food for finches, goldfinches. And, you know, my office kind of faces out towards my garden. And while I've been working here this week, I noticed that I have at least 4 different kinds of finch species that are now inhabiting my garden at this time of year, which makes me so happy. So I have pine siskins, I have American goldfinches, I have red poles, and of course I have northern juncos, which are kind of loosely related to the finches as well. So, you know, it's important that we have insects in the garden because insects also provide food for birds. If you are, when you do cut down your stalks, try and leave a stub if you can. We try and encourage people to leave a stub of the stalk that's at least 8 to 10 inches. So those smaller mason bees can still use those, or other insects can use those stalks. Take what you do cut down, just tie it up or bundle it loosely. And instead of bagging it up into a yard waste bag, if you can, leave it in, say, you know, a quiet corner of your garden in case there are eggs or overwintering insects in them, and that will give them an opportunity to come out. So you can just, you know, leave them in a pile. And if you did leave your leaves in your garden, which is a great practice to feed your soil, try not to rake them up. Leave them if you can. I do a little bit of a light raking in some areas where I have thickly matted leaves, because I do have some trees where the leaves don't necessarily break down. And I will give them a quick rake over to allow the spring ephemerals and bulbs to come up through there. But that's, you know, and then I'll pile the leaves somewhere because there's probably, you know, insects in there as well. Hold off on mulching for the same reason, because most people don't realize 70% of our native bees actually are ground dwellers. And so those eggs would have been laid in the previous summer. The larvae would have overwintered, and so they're going to be emerging from the soil. So don't cover up all the soil with a thick layer of mulch until the temperature is consistently, I would say, you know, above 10 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. I mean, you could wait probably, because the reasons for mulching are typically to suppress weeds and hold in moisture. So you can wait almost until the beginning of June before you really need to put any mulch on your garden. So, you know, the message is that a messier garden is also a biodiverse garden. So that's kind of our recommendations on garden cleanup. This is a photo that was taken of, I think, a rain garden installation that someone had put in. And you notice the contrast here. I mean, all of the neighbors have these wonderful green lawns, and then you have this wonderful swath of native plants that functions not only as habitat for insects, pollinators, and birds, but it acts as a rain garden, which means that, you know, when we have significant rain events, it runs off of the roof through the downspout into the rain garden and actually percolates slowly into the ground, as opposed to rushing off into the storm sewer and overwhelming the storm sewers. The grass in here still has its seed heads on it. This is little blue stem, which is another favorite grass of mine. So, you know, and they've left it there. They'll probably cut it down at some point, but they've left it. This is another photo in my garden, and I talked to you about the leaves. So I haven't really moved too many here, but you can see that, you know, I have small bulbs, but this is a whole big patch of bloodroot, and it's just popping right up through those leaves. And once the worms become very active in your garden, they will help to pull those leaves down into the soil, and they will break down and actually end up feeding your soil. And so, you know, healthy soil is another way to keep your garden very healthy. So you're ready to do your cleanup, and you need to think about having the right tools for the job. One of my favorite tools for cleanup in the spring, of course, is hedge clippers. They make short work of most stalks. Thicker stalks, of course, I will get out secateurs, but I find hedge clippers really help me get through the job fairly quickly. One of the things that I've started to do over the last couple of years is what we call a chop and drop, which means that you're really not taking any of the stalks out of the garden at all. What you're doing is sort of chopping it in small pieces from the top down with a set of hedge and just literally letting that drop onto the garden. So it's another way of adding more organic matter into your garden and not having to worry about having a pile of waste that you need to either bag up or, you know, add to your compost pile. The only time I don't do that is for things that tend to be kind of over self-seeders in my garden. Sometimes with those, I will actually cut some of the stalks, or at least the seed heads, off in the fall. But some of them I leave because they provide food for birds. And so if I know that, you know, by dropping them, I'm probably going to create a problem in a specific area, I will cut those flower heads off if they still have seeds in them, and I will actually add those to my compost pile somewhere. So I have another tool that I call sheep shears. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but you know, they're really handy for working for finer plants like grasses, fescue, or dropseed. So those are a couple of my favorite tools for doing my garden cleanup. As you can see, I'm tackling one of my clumps of grasses here with my head shears. And so, you know, before the grass actually starts growing is a good time to do that. And you can see that I'm not chopping it all the way down to the ground. I'm leaving a certain amount of the grass there if I can. This clump is already died out in the center. And I'm going to talk about what to do when you have a grass that actually does do that, because it's a good candidate for digging and dividing. So spring is, as I just mentioned, a good time to evaluate your plants and think about doing some dividing, moving of perennials, swapping them with friends, adding them to a local plant sale. I mean, you know, this is always a good time to do some evaluation. I mean, I do evaluations at the end of the season, but spring is another good time to do that. So you can see, as I mentioned earlier, if you have a grass where the center actually does die out, that's a good time to dig that grass up and divide it into, you know, 2, 3, sometimes even as many as 4 clumps. Or if you have perennials in your garden where somehow a lot of weeds have gotten into the center of that clump, this is a good time to dig those perennials up, to dig those weeds out, and to kind of start again, as it were, with fresh clumps, and, you know, making sure that you actually tease those weed roots out of the clump before you plant it. If you do have plants, as you can see, this coreopsis is kind of wandered off through a bunch of iris and other plants, and it doesn't have that kind of really nice emphasis, nice clump forming impact in the garden. And so you might want to, you know, dig that one up and maybe, you know, take a few of those little pieces and put them together in one hole or something, just to get it, refresh it again in your landscape. In the lower left, you can see that's a sedum. And they have a tendency to flop in the center, so you could divide those up when they start to get too large like that. You know, whatever you want to do in your garden, this is a good time. Hostas are another great candidate for doing at this time of year. Siberian iris clumps are good to divide anything with fibrous roots, whereas the rhizomatic irises, usually they're done after they bloom. So that's kind of a July thing. So there's lots of perennials that you can be tackling and taking out. I'm just thinking, so early bloomers that go dormant, like bleeding hearts or primroses, or even wild ginger is another one that you can do at this time of year. Okay, so just to show you how to do that, because I think it's important if you haven't done this before, as you can see, you need to use a very sharp spade, and I prefer a spade to a shovel. What's the difference? A spade has a straight blade across the bottom, if you look at it that way, whereas a shovel tends to have a point to it. And so a spade, and if you take care of your spades and make sure that they're cleaned and sharpened before you start in the spring, will make a nice clean cut around the root ball of your perennial. So I always recommend starting with a good sharp spade, go all the way around the circumference, a couple of inches away from the actual, you know, crown of the plant itself, and then come back around and start to cut in underneath until you can actually lift the entire clump out. And you can see that I've lifted this entire grass clump out of the hole that it was in. And then what you can do is you can either take that spade and actually drive it right through the clump to divide it in half, or again in quarters, or you can use, this is a photo of a root knife being used. So this is another tool that I have in my toolkit that I frequently use, and that's a root knife, and that helps you to just cut through. I know people think, oh my God, I'm damaging the plant, but you're not. As long as you have enough root mass and fiber and growing stems in the clump that you've divided up, that plant will do fine. So don't worry about actually cutting through. I've seen people take an entire clump of hostas and divide them up into 10 smaller pieces, and they've all survived the the mangling, so to speak. But plants are pretty hardy, so don't feel bad about cutting through the roots like this. Here's an example of cutting through, and this is a shovel, not a spade, cutting a sedum kind of in half here. So I find that the sedums, after a few years, they do, tend to flop and do kind of spread out and die in the middle as well. So that's another plant that, can use regular division. So that's another way to do it. Just stick your spade or your shovel right into the middle and divide it into however many pieces you would like to. This is another method, and this tends to work better with daylily clumps. They tend to have these rhizomatic roots, and they're very difficult to tease apart. So if you have two what we call digging forks, you can dig the clump up and drive a fork into each side of it, and then actually pull that root mass apart, and that will help you to do that. So those are the different methods that you can use for actually dividing up perennial clumps in your garden. So here's the tools that I mentioned on the left. That's a spade, again, with that, it's slightly curved. It's not completely straight at the bottom, but as opposed to being, pointed like a shovel tends to be. The photo in the center is a root knife. And this is the one from Lee Valley, which is the one that I have in my toolkit. And it's a great tool to have for all sorts of gardening jobs. And then of course I spoke about the spading fork as well, which you can see on the right there. So now we're going to move and talk about pruning. So spring is a good time to walk around the garden, I find, with pruners, secateurs, whatever in your hand. And you can see there's a number of different pruning jobs you can be doing at this time of year. So pruning, the things you want to be looking for in the spring, and I'm going to talk about, what the specific things are you want to prune. But you can actually start this before the frost is even out of the ground. And the reason I like to walk around and look at my shrubs and trees at this time of year is they don't have leaves on them. So it gives me a better view of what's going on with that particular tree. I can look at the shape of it. I can see if I've got branches that are crossing in the inside. I can see if there's damaged branches, and I get kind of a good sense for any dieback that there, or disease that there might be on it. So, but also you want to be looking at particularly shrubs that you want to kind of, maintain a certain size, and, pruning is a good way to do that. And I'm going to talk about the good ways to prune and not to prune, to remove any undesirable growth in it, and just to keep the plant vigorous. So the example there on the upper left, you can see with lopping shears, I'm actually tackling a red dogwood. And the reason you want to do that, and I'm taking out some old branches there, and the reason you want to be doing that is because red dogwoods, the reason to have them in your garden is for that beautiful winter interest, the beautiful red bark that you get on newer growth. As it ages, the older growth tends to get kind of, speckled, brownish colored, and doesn't have that vibrant red to it anymore. So one of the things you want to be doing in spring is to remove some of that older growth, and that will help to regenerate new growth, and that'll get you that vibrant color back. What I tend to do with mine every, about 3 years or so, I just lop the whole thing back, which is called coppicing. And then all of that new growth will basically be the same height, size, thickness, and it just, to me, it's just very attractive in the garden. So I'm going to talk about what we call the 3 Ds of pruning. And that is dead, diseased, and damaged. So as you're walking around your garden, this is what you're looking for. The photo on the left was, I think I bought it on sale. It's Freeman maple. I think it's Autumn Blaze, one of those ones. It was on clearance at, you know, one of the box stores or something. But it was, I think it was damaged already, you know, because they don't get watered regularly. So you can see the main leader there has died off. And what I need to do at this point is come in with either a saw or lopping shears and take that out so that I can train a new leader for that tree. So that's, you know, I don't normally prune maples in the spring. I don't recommend it because the sap runs on them, but dead wood, no problem. You can trim that off. In the center, that's actually a photo of a pagoda or alternate leaf dogwood that has what's called golden canker on it. And again, this is why it's great to do this at this time of year, because you can see the branches that have died as a result of that fungal infection that gets into it. And so I can actually tell which branches I need to be pruning off of those trees in early spring. And of course, the photo on the right there is a branch of, I'm not sure if that's a rhododendron or something else that, you know, the weight of the snow got too heavy on it and it actually ended up snapping it. And of course, that was badly damaged and needed to be removed. So those are the 3 Ds. So that's a good place to start with your pruning. What can you be pruning in late winter and early spring in addition? Fruit trees, of course. So, you know, March is a good time to get out. If you have apple trees, it's a good time to get out there and give your apple trees and make sure you leave just the appropriate number of fruiting spurs for your apples and take out any, you know, water spouts, as they call them, any vigorous growth that you want to kind of cut back. Roses, I typically wait, and I want to show back here. I think it's kind of blurry, so it's not a really good photo. The one in the center top here is actually a rose, and you can see that there's just a bud starting to show below where that pruning cut has been made. And so that's what you want to wait for with roses. You want to wait until you actually start to see where the new growth is, and that will tell you where you need to actually prune back to. Anything that doesn't get growth on it or has turned brown is usually something you want to cut off. Any spring flowering shrubs like forsythias, or I have a northern spice bush in my garden, or magnolias, you don't want to be pruning those before they bloom because they generally tend to set their buds the previous autumn. So you wait with those until after they finish blooming. Evergreens, if you have dwarf evergreens or an evergreen that you really want to try and maintain the shape and size of, you can actually prune those. And the new growth on an evergreen is called candles. And while they're still soft and green and fairly immature, you can prune those without doing any damage. Once that branch has hardened into mature wood, you don't want to be pruning because it won't grow a new tip on it. But while it's still green, you're fine to go and prune evergreens. And of course, you know, there's all sorts of vines that you can be pruning. You know, I have a wisteria, and I usually give it a good hard prune in the spring as well. Okay, tools for pruning. My favorite tools are my #2 Felco pruners. I've had these for, oh, I don't know, probably going on 30 years now. And they're still going. So these are what we call bypass pruners. And for most of my light pruning, so branches that are, you know, usually about less than 1/2 inch, 2 centimeters thick, I will use my Felco secateurs, bypass pruners. For deadwood, I have a pair of what we call anvil pruners, which the blade actually ends. It doesn't pass the piece on the other side. It actually stops there. And for things like dead branches, I find anvil pruners are usually more effective. So always have a good, sharp, clean, and disinfected pair of secateurs ready to go. Disinfected. The way I do it is I guess they've become hard to get since COVID started, but Lysol wipes, any kind of disinfectant wipe. And I keep a bottle of alcohol that's more than 70% alcohol usually in my tool bag. And so I will actually take the wipe, I will soak it with some alcohol, and I'll make sure that I wipe the blades of all my tools down as I'm moving from one tree to another, especially if I'm working on, say, one of my dogwoods, which is diseased. I want to make sure I'm cleaning my tools before I start, and I clean them again after I'm finished. So do remember. Another tool for pruning, lopping shears. I talked about that. And generally this is for branches that get to be thicker than 2 centimeters. You can usually go up to 1.5 inches, maybe even 2 inches with lopping shears. But if you get to something that is thicker than that, you want to make sure you've got a pruning saw in your toolkit as well. And this is an example of a folding pruning saw. There are some that don't, and I mean, there's a number of good varieties that you can get. So you want to make sure you have that as well. So I'm going to stop here for a sec, Lara, and we can start to tackle some questions, because I think I've seen a few already come through on the Q&A. Ooh.
You have.
And I don't see them, so you're going to have to read them to me.
Okay, here. I have a few here. Okay, the first one that came in, and it can be done after, but could you share, this is from Isabel, but could you share a resource or list that we can find native plants to the area? And we could share that out perhaps at the end. I can send it to Isabel. I have her contact information. And then her question.
Let me just, I can tell you that we do have a list, and it is available on the Durham Master Gardeners website.
Perfect. Isabel had a second question, is how to balance the mosquitoes in the summer with plants?
Well, so balance them with plants. So the implication there is that having a lot of plants draws a lot of mosquitoes to your garden, which I think that's a bit of a garden myth. The only way that you end up with a lot of mosquitoes in your garden is if you have sources of standing water that mosquitoes can actually breed in. That's not to say they can't come to your garden from, say, a nearby pond, or if your neighbor's got, standing water in their garden, but plants don't generally have an effect on creating more mosquitoes in your garden. I mean, I have mosquitoes in my garden. There are times when I can't sit outside because but I know that there's a couple of ponds that aren't far from my yard, and I'm sure the mosquitoes are coming from there. So having plants in your garden doesn't have a positive or negative effect on the number of mosquitoes you're going to get, is what I'm trying to say.
We have a question from Fran asking about any advice for dividing hydrangea.
Ooh, hydrangea is a shrub, and I wouldn't say that is something you would want to divide. So shrubs are woody plants. And the thing with a woody plant is that it's very much like a tree. At its base, at its crown, it has its stem. And, even though shrubs will have multiple stems, they still kind of merge into, kind of one joint at the root ball. So they're not really dividable. I would not recommend dividing a hydrangea. I mean, if it's a shrub that's become too large, then you could prune it. And there's a number of things that you can do in terms of what we call rejuvenation pruning, which is to take a third of the shrub all the way back to the ground in over, a few successive years. So you're never sort of taking all of the, ability for it to generate food away at once. But that's a good way of taking an older and overgrown shrub and what we call rejuvenate pruning it. But I wouldn't recommend dividing it.
Okay. I have a few more here. I know there's a lot coming in and we'll try and get to them all today or just at the end. Are there any places to buy tools at a good price, or do you know any secondhand shops that sell tools?
I'm not aware of any secondhand shops, but I can tell you that I've been looking at, if you're a social media user, I know I've seen, is it Max Sold, posting lots of kind of garagey sale. I saw a whole bunch of garden tools, I think about a week ago. They were actually being sold literally out of a garage. There was a whole pile of them. And so, look for those Facebook Marketplace, Max Sold, Kijiji is another place to go and look. I'm not aware of any actual, retail outlets around here that would sell secondhand store or secondhand tools. I mean, you could always go look at, no, I don't think I've even seen them. You could try Value Village. I mean, I don't know. So, try something like that, but, good thought for maybe a future, we could get together and have a tool garage sale or something and collect old tools. Good thought.
Good idea. Okay. Someone is asking about how they can improve the quality of their soil because a lot of their new plants are becoming diseased.
Okay. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So if we can hold that question, I'm going to cover that off in this talk.
Okay, and I'll try and get through a few more here. There's some, and there is a few about soil, so I think that's great that we're going to cover that. Someone was asking about how do you prune or manage climbing roses?
How do you prune and manage climbing roses? Well, that's almost a whole discussion on itself. One of the things that I do with climbing roses, I don't grow roses myself, so I can't remember, rambler types, I think, is I make sure I prune some of the, the thinner stems in the fall so that they don't, kind of get blown around because we've had some, vicious winter winds and storms. And it's the same as a shrub rose. You want to be looking for where your new growth is coming from and cutting back to a good strong bud on the outside of wherever your, however your climbing rose happens to be growing. And the other thing that I look for with roses is to create a nice framework of good strong stems, and then take the thinner and the weaker ones out. So you're always kind of keeping, maybe 5 or 6, good strong on whatever arbor that you're growing them on, and then take the thinner and weaker ones out. And that will also encourage better blooming. So that's kind of a quick, but I mean, roses is kind of a whole separate session on its own.
Okay, a few more here. There's some great questions coming in. I have a wisteria for 4 years and it is not flowering. What should I do?
I've heard so many people say this. Well, so let me tell you, I have a wisteria and mine blooms like mad every year. And the one thing I do every spring is I prune that sucker back really, really hard. And I don't know whether, I've kind of hit on, that's the first time I've grown a wisteria, if I've hit on, the magic solution, but I find a good hard pruning on my wisteria in the early spring, and I'll probably get out and do that soon, sometime in mid-March. I'll get my ladder up there and give it a good hard pruning. And mine blooms, and I don't do anything else to it. I don't fertilize, I don't coddle it, you know. And now mine happens to be a North American native wisteria. So I have I think the variety name is Blue Moon. And so it's not one of the Asian types. I've never tried to grow one of those, but I have friends who are master gardeners who have had them for, you know, 10 years without any blooms on them. So I just, you know, if I have a plant like that in my garden, I just look at it and go, okay, time, gone. If you're not going to bloom, you're not going to stay.
Okay. This Donna's asking about, she has 2 large dwarf Alberta spruces that are on either side of her front bay window, and it faces south. They're almost blocking out my bay window now. So how drastically can they be pruned, or should they be pulled out?
Well, yeah, once they get to, and that's the problem with evergreens, is that they do eventually outgrow. I mean, I know as a new gardener, I made the same mistake. I did a foundation planting around a bay window and with some junipers, and man, you know, they end up blocking the window after a while. So once it becomes mature, you can only prune on an evergreen. You can only prune those new the new growth on the very edges. So the fact that they're that big, there's the only choice for you is to actually remove and replace them if they're blocking your window.
Okay. Our next 2 questions are about soil, so I'm just going to flag them. I'm sure one is the best time to turn your soil, and about adding organic soil. So when we move to that topic, I'm sure you'll be covering that. Kaya has asked, is it best to start a dahlia indoor and plant them out, or can we plant the bulb directly in the ground? And when's the best time?
Dahlias are typically started indoors because otherwise you won't get blooms on them. So they need a really, really long growing season. So the best time to get dahlia tubers is like very early spring. Pot them up, put them in a spot, you know. I think mine are sitting here in my sunroom. Now I've got some tubers that are still sitting in my garage that I haven't potted up yet, and wait for that new growth to start. And when it gets to be, you know, I would say, you know, 15, maybe 20 centimeters, you want to pinch it back to usually, 2 good sets of leaves, because you want it to not just get, you know, long, one long growth on it. You want to encourage a little bit of bushiness. And then, of course, once we have consistently warm weather, you want to start introducing it to the outdoors, just like you do with seeds or any other plants that you move from indoors to outdoors. You need to harden them off slowly. So take them out for a certain amount of period of time and then bring them back in. And then starting in shade and then slowly introducing them into more sunlight. And then hopefully by the time the last frost date is passed, you can leave your dahlias out, and, you know, either in a pot, or if you prefer, you can take them then out of the pot and I've done that. I've planted them in my borders. But if you don't start them, if you just take that tuber and wait to plant it at the beginning of June, you won't see flowers until October. And then by then we're getting frost.
Okay. Question from, you want to do about 2 more quick ones and then we'll try and cover? Should peonies be split?
Yeah.
When?
Well, they don't, should they be? You can split peonies. You don't have to. But the time to split peonies is not the spring. So peonies is one of those exceptions where the best time to dig and divide peonies is actually in the fall. I do have quite a few in my garden. And so, you know, if I'm going to do any digging and dividing of peonies, I actually do that in September. So you want to wait until the leaves of the peonies actually start to die back. Then you can trim those just to leave, you know, about, say 10 centimeters of stalk. And with peonies, they're very deceptive because, where you actually see the stems coming out, the roots can extend a fair amount beyond that. And peonies have very thick, almost rhizomatous roots. So you want to make sure you take a good sized root ball around your peony as you're leveraging it out of the ground, because those thick roots can really spread a fair way out. But just like any of the other perennials we talked about, you can take, and typically what I do with mine is I take the soil off, wash them down so I can actually see the crown of the peony. And what you want is to have the root piece that has what we call 3 to 5 eyes on it. And the eyes look like small buds. They might be pink, they might be white. And so you don't want to divide any less than that. So 3 to 5 eyes is typically a good sized piece of peony root. You want to trim off any broken ones, and then you can dig a new hole and or give it to a friend. And so, peonies are the exception. You don't do them in the spring, you do them in September.
Okay. I'm going to do 2 more quick ones, and I know we have a few here. We'll get to them at the end. Someone asked about echinacea and yarrow last year that they planted, and both grew to be a lot taller than they thought by the end of the season, a bit wild and overgrown. And the question is, can they be trimmed throughout the season to keep them controlled?
Yep. So one of the techniques that, if you've ever watched my favorite British gardener, Monty Don, one of the things that they do in the UK to control the size and sometimes the bloom time of perennials is, and they call it the Chelsea chop. Reason is because they do it right around the same time as what is typically the Chelsea Garden Show, which I think is usually in early May in the UK. Well, they're usually for a good 4 weeks ahead of us in terms of the season. So as your perennials are starting to grow, and I use this technique with sedums, and it helps to, kind of get them a little bit bushier as opposed to long and leggy, is just give them a bit of a chop. And, again, like the rule of thumb with shrubs, trim them back by about 1/3. So if you've already got, a good, foot, 25 centimeters of growth, take that back by about 1/3, and that'll help that plant to, start new growing points, which will help it to bush out, and it will also help you to manage the size. One of the plants that I keep saying to myself, I need to remember to do this, is my Culver's root, because inevitably by, the time that one is blooming, it's also flopping all over my garden. And so I have a note in my garden book to make sure I remember to do that for that one this year. But you absolutely can do that. You don't want to do it more than once. You usually want to try and do that in the spring. I don't know if you want to try it, you could try some of the plant, you could chop it at one point in time and wait and do the other part of a plant a little bit later, and just, kind of compare what the growth will be like. But certainly you can chop them back.
Okay. And our last question for now, we'll let you go on with your presentation. We do have others there. Again, we'll try and get answers for them. If not today, we will email them to you. But we have cedars that are becoming see-through. What can we do to thicken them? When is the best time?
All right. So cedars are a bit tricky, because if they're coming see-through, is it because they've become really kind of old and overgrown? I don't know. So it depends on how old they are. You can give cedars, as opposed to shrubs, kind of a nice trim at the edges, and that will help to, as long as it's the green part that you're cutting, because cedars will not, like most evergreens, with one exception, which are used, they typically won't grow back from old wood. So you always want to make sure that you're trimming cedars like on the edges, which is usually where the new growth is. And, if you use head shears and just, give that a nice trim, it will encourage growth in that area. So that will help it to thicken out kind of, in that area. I know that I've seen a technique that another gardener use where they sort of, take branches and they'll bend them back in towards the inside to kind of, fill in gaps. So that's another technique that you can use, kind of tying them up to kind of, where you have those holes in your cedar, kind of take a branch and bend it back through to kind of fill that gap in. So there's a couple of techniques that you can consider with cedars.
Okay. And then I'm going to let Ingrid get back at her presentation, and we'll try and get to the rest of these questions at the end.
Okay.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, I actually stole this slide from another presentation that we did recently on, what can a gardener do in winter? And this is planning and preparing for spring. So one of the things you want to think about, I know people are anxious to get in the garden and, and I've said, kind of wait a bit before you start your cleanup. So maybe it's a good time to do a little bit of planning. Walk around your garden, think about some of the things that, you saw in other people's gardens in the winter that looked interesting, that might be things you want to add to your garden. As I mentioned before, the dogwoods have those beautiful different colored branches which add interest to your garden in winter. There are trees that have variations in their bark or in their shape. So maybe there are some things that you can be researching about how you want to create a longer season of interest in your garden. Lots of things that you can be doing in terms of planning. And one of the things that a lot of us do is, there's one project or one part of my garden that I want to tackle this year. Even if you've got a garden that you've kind of, had for a number of years, there's always some part of the garden maybe that didn't quite, make you happy or thrill you, or, maybe you want to change something in your garden. Or you're very fortunate and you've moved to a new home and you've got a whole blank slate. So, think about what you want your garden to look like. And I'm recommending that people make something called a bubble diagram. You don't have to have landscape design skills to be able to do this. So here's what it looks like. This is a bubble diagram or a bubble plan. And essentially, you have the measurements of your lot, you position your house and any hardscaping on it, if you've got a patio, a driveway, whatever, a garden shed. And then think about the areas, the way you use your garden. Do you need a lawn? Do you have kids? Do you have, animals who need lawn space? Where do you want your flowering beds? Where do you want your shrubs? Where would you like to create maybe a woodland garden by planting a tree and having some lovely shade plants underneath it? Maybe this is the year, like so many other gardeners, you want to have a vegetable garden. I think almost everybody in North America is vegetable gardening now. And maybe you want to think about putting in a compost area. So you can just, roughly sketch those out. And that at least gives you an idea of how you would like to use your garden before you run out to a garden center and buy plants. So now you have an idea of what you'd like to, and then you can start putting together what I call your work plan. You can say, okay, this year I'm going to focus on the vegetable garden. What is it that I want to be growing in my vegetable garden? And you can make a list of the vegetables before you actually go and order your seeds or go to the garden center and buy plants. So it's not, and being one of these gardeners who is also prone to running to garden centers and seeing plants that I want and buying them before I even think about where I'm going to put them. I know that, I shouldn't be the one who to tell people not to do this, but generally it's not a good idea to do that. So, because your garden can start looking like, a collection of different plants as opposed to a nice cohesive design. So spend a little time and do a plan. This is a good time of year to order seeds. If you haven't got your seed orders in, I'm telling you that a lot of the seed companies are already back ordered, but don't despair. I was in Canadian Tire today and they've got their racks of Mackenzie, OSC, and other seeds already in. So, if you haven't had time to go and order your seeds, this is a good time to maybe start looking at some places. And if you're going to be, ordering seeds or plants, think about adding some native plants, to your garden as well. We need to encourage our native pollinators and more of our wildlife. And so, there's places there, and I know there was a question about that. These are a couple of examples, but we do have, I think, a list on the Durham Master Gardener's website, along with some plants that you can think about adding to your garden as well. And, that's a whole other presentation as well. So you've got your seeds and you want to start some seeds. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can start your seeds. You can start your seedlings indoors. You can buy inexpensive trays at garden centers and box stores and start your own seedlings. And this is generally a good idea if you want to be growing things like tomatoes, peppers, basil. They generally say on the seed package, start them 6 to 8 weeks before your final frost date. I think here in Durham region, that generally tends to be around May 15th, but take that with a grain of salt, because we've had frost as late as the end of May some years, when winter likes to play nasty jokes on us. So do start your seedlings soon. The end of March is typically a good time to start things like tomatoes. And then, of course, there are things that are better off sown directly into the garden. And for very early crops, a lot of the cool weather crops like the lettuce, spinach, and the whole cabbage family like kale, those kinds of things, they can be sown into the ground almost as soon as the frost is out of the ground. I would say probably more like April. When you take a clump of soil and it isn't sopping wet, it starts to be a bit dried out, then you can start actually sowing directly. I'm not going to get into detail on winter sowing. That's kind of a whole separate thing. This is also a good time to think about adding cold frames or raised beds to your garden if you haven't done that. If you happen to be a handyman or know a handyman, you can go and build your own. And there's lots of DIY plans that are available on the internet. If you're not that handy, there are cold frames or raised beds that you can actually purchase online. And that's a great way to, extend your growing season. So cold frames help to extend that, or to have, vegetables and, perhaps even flowers or herbs if you have a fairly limited space. I find raised beds generally allow you to grow things if you don't have a lot of space, or if you live in a subdivision and they've stripped most of the topsoil off. A raised bed's a good alternative there as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about, so you run off to the garden center and you've bought yourself a whole bunch of flats of plants, and now you need to actually get them into the garden. So just a few tips if you're a new gardener and you haven't done this before. A lot of annuals come in what we call cell packs. Sometimes they're usually in 4s, sometimes they're in 6s. This is an example of pansies that come in 4s. And when you remove them, quite often the roots are kind of, a literal mass in the bottom. And, people will take that entire plug and just sort of pop it right into the ground. What you want to think about is to actually, sometimes I will actually rip that whole clump of root off the bottom. Annuals will, a lot of these plants have been, coddled and fed in greenhouses, and they've grown a lot of root material. You can take some of that off and the plant will be just fine. So you want to, look at your root as you take the plant out, but you also want to think about the soil where you're going to plant it in. So do a little bit of prep in your soil, in your bed, before you actually start planting your annuals out. Add some organic matter, compost if you have it. If you don't, go buy some compost. I have a specific preference for a mushroom compost because I know that it won't have weed seeds in it, but any kind of compost that you can buy in bags or that you have access to is okay to add to your soil. Make sure that your bed is dry enough to be planted in. You don't want something that is still quite soggy. If you have heavy clay soil, you want to give it a bit of time to dry up before you start doing it. So, you know, you've prepared it. Using a trowel, dig some small holes, slightly deeper than the plants themselves. So annuals, you can actually plant a little bit deeper, and then you want to make sure that that kind of little root ball, that potting soil that's on there is completely covered with soil. I've actually seen where people have planted them and that, you know, that kind of potting compost is actually exposed. And what happens is it will completely dry out and your plants will die. So you always want to make sure that you completely cover that up. You can, as you're digging, you can mix some slow release fertilizer into the hole, or if you're someone who prefers to use a liquid fertilizer, once you've got your annuals planted and you're watering them in, you can have some fertilizer as you water it. So that's kind of annuals. Next, I want to talk just quickly, because I know one of the things that people love to do is to go out and buy the latest, greatest perennials at the garden center, and there's lots of great container grown perennials available, usually by early to mid-May. You want to make sure that you match the growing needs of the plant. Most of these plants will have a little tag on it, and it will tell you whether it needs to be planted in full or part sun or full shade. So you want to make sure that you match that, and usually it gives you an idea of the moisture needs of that plant as well. So if you're buying a plant that has high moisture needs, you don't want to be planting it into an area of your garden that is fairly dry in the summer, unless you want to be watering every day. So prepare your garden soil again. So it's the same as with annuals. You want to be adding organic matter to it, you know, compost or leaf mold. Dig a hole that's wider than the pot that you're planning on putting in, but not deeper. So the difference between annuals and perennials is a perennial always wants to be planted at exactly the same level. You don't want to be covering the crown of the plant up. So you can make that hole a little bit wider. You can add a little bit of compost or fertilizer to your hole, and then, you know, place your plant in that. And again, as you lift that plant out, inspect the roots. You know, if the roots are circling all the way around, try and tease some of those apart. Usually what I do is when it comes in a pot, I kind of run my hands up and down the side of the root ball just to get some of those very fine fibrous roots to come loose and out, so that they will actually head out into the garden soil to help that plant to establish and grow well. So backfill it carefully, making sure you're eliminating air pockets, tamp the soil around it thoroughly, and then give it a good watering again. So spring is a good time to keep an eye out for certain insect pests that become active in early spring. One of the things I always tell people to do is, if you do have apples or crab apples on your property, you want to be looking for the eastern tent caterpillars that tend to take up residence. They tend to love those types of trees particularly. So you always want to make sure you're cleaning those out as soon as you see them. So monitor those if you do have fruit trees in your garden. Again, one of the things about planting native plants is that you're attracting potentially beneficial insects into your garden. So having birds is a great form of insect control. Having plants that will attract things like ladybugs, which help to control aphids. And of course, you know, there are nematodes for controlling grubs in the garden. You can use dormant oil sprays. So if you do have trees that are prone, like apples and pears, that are prone to certain kind of bugs, you can actually put dormant oil on them, or you can actually paint certain types of physical, or put certain types of physical barriers around the base of the trees that actually prevents the insects from getting up. So that's just a quick, again, insect and pest control is almost like a whole separate discussion onto its own. Same with lawn care in the spring. So you can be aerating your lawn. As you can see, this is just being done with a spading fork, just, you know, adding some holes into it. Overseeding is something that is recommended to help make your lawn a little more, to make it healthier, and in order to try and prevent weeds from actually getting root in your lawn. By overseeding it and making sure that your lawn is healthy, you're actually preventing weeds from getting an opportunity to get started. You can do a little bit of compost top dressing in very early spring. I would do this, and make sure your first cuttings are done fairly high. So you always want to set your blade much higher in the spring so that you're not cutting too much the first couple of times. Deep waterings only if you need to, because usually in the spring we have ample rain, and unless, you know, we have an unusual spring where we don't have any rain at all, you really don't need to worry about watering your lawn. For those who have problems with things like oh my God, my brain just went. I'm thinking crab apples, crabgrass. You can apply something called corn gluten meal to your lawn, and that actually prevents the germination of the seeds of crabgrass, because crabgrass is an annual. And so you will, if you already have it in your lawn, you've certainly got, you know, a bank of seeds that's already there. So by putting corn gluten meal down, you can actually prevent those and of any other annual weeds, or even, you know, weeds like dandelions. Hopefully, it'll actually help to prevent those from germinating into your lawn. Want to stay on top of weeds at this time of year as they get going. So annual weeds like lamb's quarters, it's good to have a little weed book, or, you know, go online. OMAFRA certainly has a good guide to common Ontario weeds. So learn to recognize weeds when they're still fairly small and tackle them as soon as you see them. So annual weeds, you don't really need to do too much. If you have any kind of a hoe, usually by the time you hack them down, you've killed them anyway. You can pull them out, but usually you don't need to do more than just sort of cut them off right at ground level. Perennial weeds like the thistle, Canada thistle in the middle, which gets a very long taproot on it, you're actually going to have to dig those out, because you do not want to leave any bit of the root. Any piece of root that's left will in fact regrow, just like dandelion roots do. And of course, if you've got a weed like bindweed up on the right side here, you cannot even attempt to try and dig all of those out. So the most effective way that I have found to manage bindweed in the garden is to continue cutting it off at soil level, and in areas where it has become, you know, really a problem, I put down cardboard and mulch to try and kill that patch of it off completely. So there's just a few tips there for dealing with weeds. So now we're getting to the part on, I know that a lot of you had questions on soil and composting. So the best way for you to have a healthy garden, I mean, we used to think that, you know, the way you needed to have a healthy garden was just, you know, adding bags and bags of fertilizer. Well, we now know that that is actually counterproductive. The best way to have a healthy garden is to make sure you start with healthy soil. And healthy soil has a lot of organic matter in it. And the reason why organic matter is important is because it attracts all of those all of the, you know, critters that live in soil, springtails, protozoa, there's nematodes, and nematodes, good ones, there are good ones, there are also bad ones. All of these little microscopic things that live in soil actually create, you know, through their waste products or by dying, they create all of those micro and macronutrients that feed our plants. So by actually feeding your soil, and you feed soil by adding organic matter to it, you're indirectly also feeding your plants. The best thing that you can do is to start a compost. Even if it's only just for your yard waste, if you can have a very simple composting system, a couple of bins, one bin, or you can go to Durham Region sells composters if you have a very small yard, and just take your leaves and your organic matter, garden waste, and add it to a composter, and make sure then that you take that back into your soil in the spring. So spring garden waste, I don't like to add, so there's a couple of things that I'm going to recommend that you don't add to your compost. So any kind of invasive weeds. So if you've dug out things like the Canada thistle that I talked about in the weed section, or bindweed, or any of the sow thistles, any of the other ones that kind of have those running roots, do not put that into your garden composter. The reason is because usually if we compost in our gardens, that's called cold composting. And it won't be enough to actually destroy those particular kinds of weeds. And if you happen to also have invasive plants in your garden, like dog strangling vine or garlic mustard, you don't want to add those to your compost either. Okay, so those are the things that you usually want to keep out of, and any other plants like goutweed or mint that will spread like mad. You don't want to add those to your compost pile. Try and chop your organic matter up if you can as you're adding it to your compost pile. And it's also good to make sure that you turn your compost to make sure that it's got enough air in there to help break down the organic matter. The ideal system, of course, is a 3-bin system where you can, be moving your compost from one year to the next, and in the 3rd year, it's ready to add to your garden. But if you have a smaller yard, maybe you need to go with something a little simpler. So here's what I said, a 3-bin system. I think I just pulled that plan right off of the internet. So if you have space, and if you know someone who's got some good carpentry skills, you can build something like that. The photo on the right was actually a friend whose garden I visited, and she had this amazing compost system that she'd had built. And I had to take a picture of it because I was in compost bin envy. But if you have a small garden, even a simple composter like this, I think this is called a beehive composter, wood that you can tuck into a corner somewhere is fine as well. Because you're not going to be in a smaller garden, you're not going to be producing that much yard waste. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about fertilizing, but there are 3 basic macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, that all plants need. And if you're buying fertilizer and it says on the bag 10, 10, 10, it means that it's 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. So that's usually, or 20, 20, 20. Those are usually kind of, what we call balanced fertilizers. There are some fertilizers that are designed to help fruiting plants, say, so if you're growing tomatoes, and you can usually in the stores find a particular brand of fertilizer, whatever your choice happens to be, that will say, this is good for vegetable gardens, or this is good for roses. And they tend to be formulated to, with the particular percentages of those 3 nutrients that plants need. The ones below that are what we call micronutrients. And by and large, our soil here in Durham region is not deficient in any of those micronutrients. So you shouldn't really need to worry about those. I will caution you though, that by and large across Durham region, because during the ice ages, the soil here was formed from a limestone shelf, our soil tends to have a fairly high pH. I've had the soil in my garden tested, and I know I've done a couple in the Oshawa area as well, and we generally tend to be about 7.5, which is considered on the high side. So the pH scale, 7 is kind of neutral. Anything below that is considered acidic or slightly acidic. Anything above that is considered alkaline. So our soil tends to be a bit on the alkaline side. The only reason you need to know that is if you're growing plants that tend to like acidic soil. So if you're planning on starting a blueberry farm, it might be a bit tough. I grow rhododendrons. It's an exercise in frustration mostly, but they've sort of limped along and I've managed to keep them going. But generally I recommend to people not to try and fight nature because we really can't do a lot to change our underlying soil. We're going to talk quickly about mulch. For those of you who like to mulch your gardens, I know that the shredded cedar mulches that are sold in the box stores tend to be fairly popular. What I prefer to do is to actually mulch my garden with compost. So the aforesaid mushroom compost that I love to use, I will actually go and spread that as a compost if I need to suppress weeds in certain areas of my garden, and especially in my vegetable garden. But there's a range of things that you can use. So organic mulches, cocoa bean hulls. If you have animals, you don't want to do that because chocolate is toxic to dogs. So you don't want to be using that around if you have dogs in your household, but you can get pine bark nuggets. You can use decorative stone. And there is no reason why you can't have a living mulch. So as you can see in the photo of the ajuga plant, and there are lots of other ground covers that will actually do what they're designed to do, which is to cover ground, protect the soil from both weeds and to keep that moisture in the soil, which is really why you're using mulches. I think I stormed through that pretty quickly. Okay, so kind of a summary of things that you're going to be doing in the spring. You're going to be doing cleanup, but you're going to hold off until the temperature is consistently about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. You can start to divide or move some of your perennials as soon as the frost is out of the ground and the ground is fairly friable and workable. You can do light pruning and you can start that now in March. You certainly can be starting seeds indoors. There are some things that you can be doing as soon as the frost is out of the ground to take care of your lawn. This is a good time of year to be overseeding in order to thicken your lawn, thicken the growth of your lawn up. You can start monitoring for certain insects, probably not this early, but you will start seeing some insects becoming active probably by April. You can be amending your soil, you can be planning, and as I said, try and hold off at least until very late spring before you start doing any mulching. All right, I think we're ready to, oh, here's a quote that I always love to put a quote at the end of a presentation like this. So this is a quote from the famous Margaret Atwood, and she says that in spring, at the end of the day, you should smell like dirt. So hopefully this spring, we will all smell like dirt. Here's some information. I mentioned our website. So there's our web address for the Master Gardeners, where we have some tip sheets available. If you do have questions that come up this spring, you can contact us through our email. We also have a Facebook page and we have an Instagram account, and we do have people monitoring all of those. So you can post those questions in any one of those places. And we'll handle some more questions now.
Okay, thank you. There's quite a few here. I do know if we don't get to them that the website does have a sheet you can fill in, and one of the Master Gardeners will answer your questions. So
okay.
From Christina, do you have to remove old mulch before laying new?
No, um, no, if the mulch is an organic mulch, which is usually, wood chips or, nuggets or something like that, they will over time break down. So, if your mulch is still there and all you're doing is just topping it up, no, you don't need to take your old mulch away. It's fine.
Someone said if you're, can you put leaves that have black spots into the compost?
Yep.
Okay.
So the black spot is, it's also called tar spot, and it happens to Norway maples. There may be one or two other species of maple that are prone to it, but it's usually the Norway maples that were heavily planted back in the 60s and 70s. And they're prone to that. It's a fungus disease called black spot. But, the leaves will break down, and that particular fungus only impacts that particular type of maple tree. And so, it'll break down, it'll go into the garden, won't do any harm in your garden. But I mean, the spores are in the environment anyway. So that tree, if it's in your yard or if it's close to your yard, it's going to get reinfected anyway. There's nothing you can do to stop it.
Someone asked about where you get your soil tested.
Oh, okay. I get mine done at there's I can't remember the name. I think AFL, Agriculture and some Food Lab, I think at the University of Guelph. But if you want to know, there are, I think, at least half a dozen certified soil testing labs here in Ontario. And it's on the OMAFRA website. So OMAFRA is the Ministry of Agriculture and Farming and Rural Affairs. And if you actually type into your search engine, Soil Testing Laboratories Ontario, that site will pop up and it'll give you all the addresses of those different facilities that do it. And they usually have a website and they give you very specific instructions on how to take the sample, how to package it, and how to send it off to them. Okay?
Okay, I had a few questions in here about Japanese maples. Can they prune them this month
No, maples, okay. You don't want to be pruning in the spring because the sap runs, right? So a Japanese maple is no different from, any of our native maple species. So, other than dead, diseased, and damaged, you do not want to be pruning a Japanese maple now. Japanese maples should be pruned in August.
Okay. What to do with perennials that have their root balls pushed above the ground?
Take them up, dig a fresh hole, and put them back down in the ground. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, coral bells are one of the ones that tend to do that. Or sometimes if you planted a bunch of perennials in the fall, sometimes with frost heaving, they tend to get popped out. So yeah, you just need to dig the hole and pop them back in again.
Okay, a few questions about pruning. When and how vigorously should you prune a rose of Sharon?
Good question. I don't know that usually when I've done Rose of Sharon, I usually prune, I take off all of the, the spent flowers from the previous year and sort of kind of go through my rules about pruning are, I like to take off any, dead growth. And from what I've seen, Rose of Sharon, they self-seed like mad. So I would take all of those off. But like any shrub that I'm pruning, I'm looking at the shape of it and I'm looking for branches that cross on the inside, or I'm looking for thinner, weaker branches. Or, maybe I just want to bring the whole, size of it down, because I find with Rose of Sharon, after a few years, all the flowers are at the top and, they're 10, 12 feet up or something. So you might want to start bringing it back down. And again, you do only a third of the shrub at a time if you're trying to sort of bring it down to, to a size that's more manageable in the landscape.
Okay. I'm going to try and do a few more. I know that our time is almost at the end, so I did want to first say thank you, Ingrid, and to everyone for joining us. And again, we will have recorded this and it will be posted on our webpage. So if there's something you missed or need the PowerPoint presentation, it will be available on the Whitby and Bloom website.
Okay.
I'll try for a couple quick more questions here. Do clematis have a lifespan in terms of how many seasons you can get out of one before you should tear it down?
I've kind of had mixed results with clematis, so I'm not necessarily the right person to ask, but they should last for, you know, a good, I'm not aware that they have a specific lifespan, except that clematis are prone to a certain kind of fungal disease, which can actually kill them right back as the new growth is starting in the spring. I've seen that. But you know, there are some perennials in my garden that just, I have mixed results with. So I share your pain. I mean, I've spent good money on beautiful clematis only to have them, you know, die off within a couple of years. But on the other hand, I have clematis that I've had in my garden for, you know, going on, I want to say 6 or 7 or 8 years, and they're still going strong.
Okay.
So I think it's just kind of, it depends on the clematis, I think.
Great. I had a couple questions in here about Japanese beetles, if there's any way to avoid them or prevent them.
Yeah, get rid of your lawn.
Oh,
Because that's the problem that we have with Japanese beetles. So, you know, I'm going to get a bit on my high horse. Sorry, but this is one of we have become so addicted to lawns, to perfect lawns, that we have created acres and acres, and probably more like, you know, hundreds of square kilometers of perfect breeding ground for Japanese beetles, because they lay their eggs in lawns and their grubs feed on the roots of grass. And so, you know, we are going to be inundated with Japanese beetles as long as we are slaves to, you know, beautiful green lawns, unfortunately.
And somebody asked about discouraging rabbits from eating perennials, if you have any hints.
Want to see how many rabbits I have in my garden? I feed the rabbits, for crying out loud. They sit under my bird feeders and eat up the seed. No, there really is no way to prevent. I mean, yeah, there is there are some things that you can do. Some of them I think are a waste of money. There are sprays that you can go buy. I think one's called Bob X and another one is called Plant Skid. And so you can go out to a box store, you can buy these and you can go spray your plants with this stuff. If it rains, you have to respray them. So it's supposed to be some kind of a scent that, you know, repels rabbits. I would say, you know, some of the things that you can do that I think are effective are to find plants that naturally repel rabbits. I've had some luck with geraniums, believe it or not, and not the pelargonium, the annual, but geranium, the perennial, which gets the small flowers in it, you know, and you have hybrids like roseannes. You know, I tend to like the native geraniums more, but I have found that in some areas, because geraniums have a fairly strong scent in their leaves, and that can actually keep rabbits away from some plants. Marigolds have a strong scent. Allium plants, so allium bulbs, and you know, planted around tulips, for instance, will tend to keep, what is the other really stinky bulb plant? Fritillarias is another one that I have planted around certain tulips in order to keep them away. But the best way to keep rabbits away from your plants, of course, is barriers. But I don't want to wrap all of I mean, I do it with my shrubs in winter to stop the rabbits from eating the shrubs right down. I do put covers around my shrubs and protect the bases of the trees. But in the spring, I stopped doing that. I mean, you know, the only way to keep them away is to, you know, wrap it in chicken wire, and I don't want my entire garden wrapped in chicken wire. So you kind of learn to live with them.
I have two attendees that actually raised their hands, so it'll be our last two questions for the evening. I'm going to Ann Joyce, if she is still here. I have unmuted you if you'd like to ask a question.
I think she's still muted. Oh, I'm gonna stop sharing.
Sorry.
Oh, there she is.
Yes, I didn't. That was just an accident with my raising my hand. I'm sorry. I enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank
No
you.
worries.
Okay.
This is how Zoom works.
I know, we're all learning.
It happens to the best of us.
does.
No worries.
It's just too funny.
Okay. I'm gonna go to Sharon. Sharon, you have a question for Ingrid. So our last question for the night.
No, I just wanted to say thank you, Ingrid. I accidentally raised my hand as well.
Oh, we have some Zoom newbies here. That's great. I love it. I love it. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And as I mentioned, I've mentioned this a couple of times. Go to the Durham Master Gardeners website. We have information there, or you can, email us any questions, burning questions about, what to do in your garden in spring.
Okay. And again, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you, Ingrid, and happy gardening, everyone. I know I learned a lot tonight. Have a great evening.
Okay, take care.
Thanks very much.